For more on the Marikana tragedy, we are now joined in studio by Benchmarks Foundation Executive Director John Capel and the spokesperson for the Marikana Support Campaign, Dr. Trevor Ngwane. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on SABC News.
Thank you.
Now, Trevor, I know you're a doctor, but I'm going to call you Trevor because you said I'm allowed to. Let me start with you. 5 years on since the Marikana tragedy, we saw some political leaders as well as residents of Marikana saying that nothing has changed. Your sentiments on that?
Yeah, I agree with them. I think justice has not been done. People still live in the same squalid conditions. Workers still don't get a living wage. And those miners who died, their families, their widows, have not been compensated. And the people who shot them, the police, and those who pulled the strings, the big politicians, have not been brought to book.
Before I come to John, you've just mentioned now, that the people that were involved in the killings of the miners have not been brought to book. 5 years later, why has not a single police officer been held accountable?
I think we should ask President Jacob Zuma, because he's the man in charge. We should ask the government, the state, as to why, the people who killed, the miners on strike against the cheap labor system in South Africa have not yet been brought to book. But the worst part is that 17 miners are facing charges of murder, and those miners were the ones being shot at. So it's amazing that the police who shot 34 people are not being charged, but the miners whose comrades died, some of whom got injured, are being charged today.
Now, John, I'd like to bring you in here. Speaking of accountability, this is something we hear about every time the Marikana commemoration comes around, where people are like, well, no one's been held accountable yet. The widows are still suffering, but it's business as usual for everybody else. As Benchmarks Foundation, and looking at some of the research that you've done specifically in Marikana, your sentiments on who the responsibility lies with in this context?
Well, I think first and foremost, the responsibility lies with Lonmin as a corporation, that it had a responsibility towards its workers to provide proper housing, to address them in the Marikana incident that took place in 2012 known as the massacre, and that government also has a responsibility. And I think probably a lot of the weaknesses around Marikana revolve around the mining charter itself, and when it comes to housing, for example, the promises made by Lonmin from 2006 to build 5,500 houses, which is still not materialized, is a weakness in the charter, because the charter was designed to convert the hostels. And on platinum you had a growing sector, and no one took into account that you had a growth on the platinum sector and a decline in the gold sector. So it was possible to do that in the gold sector, but not in the platinum sector. Hence they give a living arts allowance, and this is part of the problem, that workers live in abject conditions without access to running water, electricity or sewage systems. And the company itself has not addressed the informal settlements where its workers live. And I think it's a problem that they report a lot, but they do nothing. There's a lot of talk, and I think we must also just say that Lonmin are really a microcosm of the mining industry, that it's the whole mining industry should be taken to task.
And I'm glad you mentioned stats in terms of numbers, saying that 5,500 houses were promised and yet nothing's been done. That's one example of some of the promises that have been broken. But let's talk about the pain and suffering that was caused, and I think both of you can definitely speak to this, where you mentioned the widows earlier on, saying that they still feel like, well, we lost our husbands, we lost our breadwinners, here we are today and nothing's been done for us. Trevor, you can take this one first.
Well, I've spoken to some of the miners who were there when the killing happened, and to this day they're still traumatized. One, they're traumatized because their comrades died in front of their eyes. Secondly, they're traumatized because they also felt that they were going to die on that day. So they had the fear of God in them. They thought that those police were going to kill them. So they haven't received much counseling. Many of them, I think even one committed suicide because the experience was so traumatic.
John, speaking of the trauma, is there any progress that you have seen at all? I mean, you mentioned the housing issues and some of the things that haven't been done in terms of the mining charter, but in terms of everything else and other issues that were raised even before the Marikana massacre, have you at any point in time, as benchmarks with all the research that you've done, seen any progress?
Very little progress on the Platinum Belt in general, around housing, around the living conditions. Then we've taken action. Our chairperson, Bishop Josie Walker, has gone to the Lonmin AGM in London, gone to BASF, the biggest buyer of Lonmin's platinum, for 3 years, trying to say to them, look, you as a buyer have a responsibility. You signed international soft law that you'll do proper human rights due diligence. You haven't done that. Surely you also have a responsibility. So he has been proposing to set up a memorial centre inside Marikana where the art of the widows can be shown, where there can be counselling services and a whole number of different things taking place. And so far there's no progress on that. BASF refused to accept any responsibility. Lonmin AGM also refused to accept any responsibility. And I think it's a problem that we face when these big corporations can't accept that they were in the wrong and should take responsibility for sorting out these problems.
I mean, you give a clear example of how you as Benchmark have gone to Lonmin and said, these are the proposals that we're making, this is what's not been done. What's the reception like, you know, when you do go to Lonmin and say, this is what's going on here? Are they hostile? Are they, you know, do they feel some sort of sympathy for their workers?
Well, at the senior sort of executive management level, they're very friendly, they're very receptive.
To you all, yes. But to the situation,
but to
it defies the whole purpose.
The situation, I think now Lonmin claim, well, you know, the good years are over, and that they're cash strapped, and that they can do very little. They have built some in what they call inbuilt apartments, some flats, about 440. They plan to build another 1,500, but that doesn't answer the problem. Lonmin employ 33,000 workers. That's about 26,000 permanent and about 7,000 subcontracted labour. So, and if one considers how many people they can house about 3,000 in total. So what happens to the rest, the other 30,000? They live in these shanty towns without access to running water, sewage, etc. So we said to Lonmin, why don't you look at the basic needs of these workers in these communities, assist with supplying proper water sources for communities, sewage systems, tarred roads, and look at the housing. I mean, look at the tin shacks and how you can improve those immediate conditions. We said that would be a far bigger project than just trying to build some show houses, because workers don't want to buy houses in the first place, and that's also a problem. So they do have some rental stock accommodation, they offer some jobs to the widows, but that's not compensation. That means nothing to the widows. They feel traumatized by having to work in the positions that their husband worked in.
Now, Trevor, you have a huge corporation like Lonmin saying the good years are over, we're now cash strapped and there's nothing we can do to assist our workers. But when the good years were there, why wasn't anything done? Because workers have been going through these conditions for a long time. I mean, we've seen it with some documentaries as well, where workers say, I work 12 hours, sometimes 16 hours a day, but I'm still living in poverty. Is there any sense in that at all?
Yeah, firstly, we've inherited the apartheid colonial cheap labor system, the migrant labor system, where black labor was, abused basically. And then now, as you say, you remember in 2000 up to about 2008, the crash, there was a boom in the platinum price. All that money ended up with the big bosses, with the shareholders. Very little found its way to the pockets of workers. Now, it's grossly hypocritical of Lonmin to turn around and say, hey, today there is no money. They should tell us, where did they spend, where did they hide all the money they made during the boom years? Because workers didn't benefit anything from that boom.
Now, a lot of the time we mention the families, who lost their loved ones and the widows that have now had to take over the role of being breadwinners. In terms of a way forward, what are their sentiments? Do they still want to be there? Are they going to Lonmin? Are they still also, working with you and working with organizations, such as that of Trevor's, to make sure that there is some sort of way forward and not just, dialogue and dialogue and dialogue? Because it seems like we've been talking about this for a long time, but the action is just not there.
I think there's very little way forward at the moment concerning this. There's a lack of political will from government to actually move this process forward. If a company doesn't adhere to its social and labour plan, in that case Lonmin had not adhered to it, nothing happens, there's no repercussions. So government has a responsibility to intervene here and ensure things are done properly. From the Benchmarks Foundation side, what we are developing is what we call an independent problem-solving service. Because what we realise is that the parties don't talk to each other. Communities and workers don't talk to management. The company doesn't talk to them. There's conflict. There's legal arguments, but no one gets down to talking. So we're trying to develop a service that can be preemptive on the one hand of disputes like this from arising, can solve matters, can bring parties together using what we call facilitated dialogue, somebody in between the process that makes sure that the company is listening, that the community is heard, that the community understands, and we're trying to sort of level the playing fields in terms of this proposal to solve these kind of issues. And there's lots of these kind of issues in mining and broader issues, just small things like cattle that we can't resolve. If you go to a company and say, we've got a problem with our cattle dying from drinking your water, your area's not fenced off, the company says, well, you should be more watchful over your cattle. The problem's not ours, it's yours. So if there's that kind of attitude, so we need a shift in thinking, we need a shift in the paradigm, in the way we approach these issues.
Now, Trevor, I want to touch on what John said in terms of a very difficult way forward, and saying that at this point in time, it doesn't really look all that hopeful. So what was the purpose of the Farlam Commission then? Was it just to determine what happened on that specific day or that specific period and then just let it go? Or aren't we supposed to be using the findings of that commission in order to almost address the issues that we see?
Yeah, well, we can talk about the Farlam Commission. But in general, the Farlam Commission was a whitewash, because its purpose was to, on the one hand, acknowledge that, injustice, atrocities were committed. But on the other, Farlam blamed the striking miners for the whole massacre. And many of Farlam's recommendations, the positive ones, have not been implemented. For example, none of the police who pulled the trigger have been charged. None of the people, the big guys who pulled the strings, have been brought to book. So on the one hand, Farlam had to be appointed, but on the other, Farlam is a defense against, a bigger injustice. And this is the injustice which John is talking about, economic injustice. The fact that the production of wealth, the minerals of the country, don't benefit the people. The money is repatriated to London, to New York. The money is repatriated to companies called Lonmin. This is the same, it was called Lonro before. It's Tiny Rowland's company. They were part of the colonial project, which in a way, wreaked havoc in Africa and other parts of the world. That injustice continues today. And Farlam's job was just to put a band-aid over a very, very grave sin against the people of Africa, of the world, of the working class.
Now, John, in terms of accountability, how do we strike a balance between, these major corporations that Trevor just mentioned, in terms of them taking a responsibility and saying, we are benefiting from these minerals, and the people that are working for us also need to benefit at some level, but also, government, that political will that we keep speaking of, but seeing none of it, as well as the communities themselves in terms of what they can do in order to almost ensure or that they are empowered in a sense.
Well, yes, perhaps we need to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission around mining to look at the legacy of mining, the exploitation in the industry.
Why are we so afraid?
And how these practices have just gone forward. Because it's going to affect profits, it's going to affect the bottom line. and we need to have a more equitable distribution of wealth. When a mine comes along anyhow, the community is there already. And the community is impacted upon, the land is destroyed, their way of life is destroyed, their livelihoods are destroyed, they suffer the health impacts, but they don't benefit. So we're sitting on a ticking time bomb, in a sense, in the mining industry, if we don't start to get to grips with what is the problem, what is the nature of the problem, what is the cause of the problem, and how do we resolve it. And I think lastly, just following up what Trevor said, this short-term focus on profits every 3 months we must turn over. There's no long-term sustainability plan within the industry. There's no long-term sustainability plan around workers or around communities, and we need to be addressing that.
Now, Trevor, your organization is actually on the ground with the families and the widows and the general community of Marikana. What are their sentiments? I mean, going into tomorrow, the 5th commemoration, you know, are they hopeful, or do they just feel like it's another event where a lot of, you know, important and prominent people are going to come into town for that day, and then they're going to leave, and then, you know, everything carries on as usual and nothing changes?
Well, there's a lot of anger and frustration on the ground, and there's a yearning, a hope for a different kind of world. I think people have gone beyond wanting to talk to Lonmin or to the big bosses. I mean, Cyril Ramaphosa, who was involved, you know, as a director of Lonmin, is now the deputy president of the country. He might become the president of the country. So what hope can, you know, those miners have in justice in the system? So there is that desire now that what we need is maybe a different kind of system where maybe number one, to nationalize the mines so that they are owned and controlled by the people of South Africa, so that the mineral wealth is beneficial to us, not to a few rich guys in London or New York or even locally. Secondly, there is that big desire for justice, you know, that desire to see those who killed their brothers brought to book, and also the desire that those big men and women in parliament should be brought down, and a new kind of government, a more just political party takes over. I think that's the feeling now on the ground.
I'm actually glad that Trevor mentioned political parties. I mean, we see that a lot around this time. Political parties speak out a lot about Marikana. We saw just before our discussion, we saw DA leader Mmusi Maimane speaking on it and saying, or giving his sentiments ahead of the commemoration tomorrow. We've seen the EFF as well, you know, going to Marikana. Your sentiments on how, you know, the politics of this all is continuously played out, because some people say, you know, other political parties, the opposition specifically, you know, use it as a way to basically take almost cheap shots at the ANC. Is that accurate, or is it a case of what Trevor's saying that maybe we do need change, we do need to see new faces leading us?
Yes, I think we do need a new model around mining, along the lines that Trevor mentions, because mining is not working for the people, it's working for the shareholders, but it's not working for the people, it's not working for the country. So we need to be challenging the present model that we have. We need to be looking at longer term sustainability of communities and how minerals can actually bring benefits to the country. And with platinum, there's a lot of things that can be done. It can be used for fuel cell development. There can be a big manufacturing industry built around it. There can be a lot of skills transfer taking place. And then I think, yes, and you know, probably if we took the profit motive out of it, we could have more sustainable mining. And that's a very radical thing for the industry to hear, but it's true.
Perhaps just to pick up on what you said, I mean, something that you mentioned was your independent problem-solving service that Benchmarks, you know, is going to start and hopefully use that as a way to assist communities such as that of Marikana, and something else is dialogue, because you've been to these corporations. But what else, just going forward, you know, into tomorrow, but also, you know, just the rest of the year and the coming years, can we expect to see or should be done to ensure that, you know, we can move on from what happened in Marikana, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and say, but this is what came out of it. Something positive came out of it. We saw some change.
Yes, well, I think the culprits have to be held accountable. I think that's the first step. Justice has to be seen to be done. Compensation must be made to the widows and orphans and the injured mine workers. I think is a major step. A memorial centre needs to be established in Marikana, and it should be a public holiday, as Bishop Joyce Yorker and the Marikana Support Group are calling for. And I think that would be, taking us one step forward. And then we have to address the issues in a more longer-term sustainable path, and we have to open up a discussion and a bigger debate.
Trevor, your sentiments in terms of the way forward?
Well, I would say never again. I think if I want to be optimistic, to be a utopian, I would say South Africa is like a recovering drug addict or alcoholic, from apartheid, from colonialism. So from that point of view, Marikana was a major relapse. So from that point of view, we shouldn't lose hope. Let us build, but we have to acknowledge that it was a relapse. It was a major glitch in our vision of a better society. So we should acknowledge that, then say never again, and move forward with the dream of a world where no one suffers, where no one sleeps hungry. I think it is still possible to have that dream.
I like that sentiment of moving forward and, living in a world where nobody suffers. Gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. But thank you so much for an insightful discussion.
Thank you.
That was Benchmarks Foundation Executive Director Don Capel and the spokesperson for the Marikana Support Campaign, Dr. Trevor Ngwane, joining me for a discussion ahead of the 5th commemoration of the Marikana massacre.